So I think that's a road we shall not travel. This is a fantastic opportunity to have a new phase of reform, to deepen the reforms that have taken place.
So no army intervention. This is not military rule. This is a government that's being stabilized by a military presence. Is that the right understanding?
It's exactly that. It was the way out of the impasse. It was the only way out constitutionally. Incidentally, the only way out, and the army has really the credit of the army, the reputation of the army among the Egyptian people has been tremendous. Imagine 18 days with those millions all over the country and not a bullet.
Thanks, Lara. Well, today, Egypt's central bank sold $1 billion worth of treasuries to help pay for the economic costs. Remember, these have been 18 days of an uprising that have hit the economy. Our Sarah Eisen is in New York tracking that story.
Margaret, the word today from the new prime minister, Egypt's economy is solid. That's a relative term, though. The banks have just been ordered to stay closed through tomorrow. The stock market open has been postponed again to Wednesday, and the cost estimates are just starting to trickle in. French bank Crédit Agricole puts that estimate at $310 million per day. And if you add all that up, it means 2% of GDP for Egypt has been wiped out. Now, Crédit Agricole predicts economic growth this year will slow to 3.7%, and that matches what Egypt's finance minister told Bloomberg. It's almost half of the growth rate that the government expected before the crisis broke out. Two significant areas have been hit: tourism and foreign investment. The finance minister says 1.2 million tourists have fled the country. Investors have pulled almost $1 billion from Egyptian stock funds. Wednesday will be a key test when the stock market reopens. After 2 weeks, even PIMCO CEO Mohamed Al-Arian told Bloomberg Television he is concerned that foreign investors won't return quickly. But Angus Blair, a local economist at Beltone Financial, tells us he's optimistic. He expects the action just from the cleanup and the rebuilding to kickstart some of that growth. Margaret?
Thank you, Sarah.
We hope the customer come again because Egypt is safe, okay, and everybody here love the customer and love anybody. But, yeah, I talk about the tourists.
12 to $13 billion of economic activity comes into this economy here in Egypt as a result of tourism. And so many workers here are hungry for that cash to come back very soon. Meantime, one thing that has really the global focus here on this country is the question of this being the heartbeat for the Middle East, the heartbeat for the Arab world. And what happened here, this uprising, will it have consequences for other countries where we are already seeing social protests? Peter Cook is in New York looking at what the U.S. definitely is keeping a very close track of. Peter?
A very close track indeed, Margaret. The protests may be winding down there in Tahrir Square, but anti-government movements in other Middle Eastern nations, they may just be getting started. We'll take you first to Algeria. Rulers from Algeria to Yemen, they are having to contend with all this and beyond. They're thinking about how they're going to respond, sometimes with force. In Algeria, in specifically, there in Algiers, protesters defied a ban on public gatherings there Saturday, took to the streets in big numbers. Some called for the ouster of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika. He's held power there since 1999, this important energy producer. 26,000 riot police armed with clubs eventually stifled the crowds, arrested some of the participants there, organizers calling for a similar rally next weekend. Meanwhile, over in Yemen, a third straight day of protests, producing clashes with police and more calls for the resignation of President Ali Abdullah Saleh. They got within a few miles of the presidential palace today. He's been in power for 3 decades. He's already said he will not seek re-election, but that has not been enough to satisfy protesters in the Arab world's most impoverished nation. He's been a key ally of the United States in fighting terrorism, a recipient of U.S. military aid and training. Meanwhile, over in Bahrain, signs of another protest movement there. Shiite marchers today clashing with police in at least one village. Last week, trying to get ahead of popular pressure, Bahrain's King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa granted each Bahraini family $2,700. The government pledged to ease media controls. The tiny kingdom, a key strategic ally of the U.S., home to the Navy's 5th Fleet. And there have been no major signs of protest yet in Saudi Arabia. In Iran, 2 former presidential candidates have called for opposition protests on Monday. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has already promised to forcefully confront any protesters there. Now, all this talk about the spread of political instability leaves one issue on the minds of traders. What's going to happen to the world's flow of oil? Adam Johnson has been talking to the pros. Adam, what are you hearing?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm hearing is that the supply and demand so finely tuned that guys are genuinely very concerned. And here's why. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Look at this. The Middle East controls 30% of the world's supply of oil. To put that in perspective, North America, all right, Canada, the U.S. and Mexico, 13, Russia, 12, China, 8. You add all those up together, it's almost the same as coming out of the Mideast. All right, so the point is when you've got so much oil coming out of an area where the supply demand is already very finely tuned, it makes people concerned, to say the least. And, of course, what also is cause for concern? Well, we broke the area down into kingdoms, strong-armed governments, and democracies. And, of course, look at how the numbers shake out. Kingdoms, all right, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Jordan, Bahrain. You've got Libya and Syria, all right. These governments, in theory, strong-armed governments. And, of course, look, democracies. I'm sure I'm going to get some email calling Iran and Iraq democracies. But technically, yes, they are democracies, as is Algeria. And that's, of course, one of the concerns. So the problem is, even in places where you have democracy, there is still evidence of perhaps threats to supply, all right? And as a matter of fact, I spoke to one trader who was hiking with Bedouins in Saudi Arabia this weekend. That's a guy who loves his job. And here's what he said, Peter, exactly what you just talked about, Algeria. Now, Algeria supplies about 2.6 of the world's oil. The other countries that are concerns to traders, Jordan, Syria, and Yemen, the good news, if there is any good news, however, each supplies less than 0.5% of the world's oil. So, again, if there is a flashpoint, if there's one concern, Margaret, that all the traders are focused on, it's Algeria. Those protests, the State Department calling for caution in Algeria, that's what traders are focused on. We saw the futures earlier. They're flat now, but we want to keep a very close eye on everything that's happening there, Margaret.
All right. Thank you very much, Adam Johnson in New York. Egypt's economy has been handicapped during these weeks of protests. There's a cottage industry boom here in Tahrir Square of Egyptian flags, of nationalist ribbons, and pictures of the Shaheed, those martyred during these weeks of protests. And as you can see behind us, a very different story from when Laura and I were here on Friday with the roar of the crowd behind us. We went out to Tahrir on the last night because, as you can see, it's dead quiet. People have gone home, but the celebrations have continued. Tahrir Square was intentionally cleaned out earlier today. The military tried to push the protesters out. But what remains is this newfound sense of nationalism. You know, I showed those ribbons that are being sold for, you know, £1 each. But you had a little bit of capitalism that came out along with this democratic movement, didn't we?
That's right. I bought this little one for 3 Egyptian pounds. That's 50 cents. And our cameraman Hossam, just behind the camera, says that that's actually a ripoff. So there is certainly some price gouging here happening there.
But you see this sense of entrepreneurialism, obviously, a lot of small business people around here. And while we saw people perhaps taking an opportunity right now, it shows as well this idea that there's a tremendous cash economy, a lot of unreported income, a lot of unbanked people. And it's just one of the other questions overhanging how to get this country's economy to be more and more inclusive. And as the firms and banks in this country try to get back to work, I went out today to a small new asset management firm that's just getting started to ask their CEO and some of their traders how they're answering their clients' questions, because there are a lot of them right now.
While Cairo is mostly back to work, life is anything but normal. Since the Mubarak regime's police force no longer exists, civilians are now directing traffic, bringing Cairo's streets to a virtual standstill, making the 30-minute commute for top fund manager Rana Adawi a 2-hour ordeal. Adawi and 5 of her employees are preparing for the markets to reopen later this week. and facing lots of questions from nervous investors.
People are worried that the policies are still unclear, although in the past 2 days we've got a lot of confirmation and a lot of signs that we are on the right track. People want democracy.
One of the questions here at the Egyptian Stock Exchange is what happens to those companies with strong ties to the Mubarak regime? Not only those that the Mubarak family invests in, but what about those government ministers? Many of them have had their own assets frozen.
Today, Egypt's largest independent daily ran pictures of 5 cronies of Mubarak. According to military prosecutors preparing criminal cases against them, each amassed fortunes topping $1 billion. Adawi's partner, Mohammed Abdalla, says the corruption investigations into steel magnate Ahmed Ez and former housing minister Maghrabi may mean that their stock prices suffer when the market reopens later this week.
I would try to avoid them as things get more clear. However, I would assume that at a certain point of time they will be a very good buy.
And in a country where traders became revolutionaries, even getting shot by rubber bullets, that fighting spirit is pervasive.
It's like a scar of war, something like that. So it's a story to tell your children and grandchildren, I guess, if I can.
And I spoke earlier today with the CEO of Egypt's largest investment bank. There are a lot of questions people are asking, not only about how to get back to work, but just what it means for some of these companies that have significant stakes or significant exposure to members of the old regime. A lot of scrutiny right now. I spoke to the CEO of EFG Hermes about this and started off by asking him, what's different today? What's different in the new Egypt versus just a few days ago?
I think what's different is, we're seeing a path to democracy. I think Egypt in 1 year will be completely different than the Egypt that you see today, from a different constitution, different cabinet, a new president. And what you're seeing today in the streets is, or what you have seen in the streets is a revolution that have led to a complete change in the regime. Short-term negative impact, obviously, because of, you cannot attract foreign direct investments, there will be employment issues. And I think the government needs to intervene to bridge that year through special measures. So it becomes a one-time sort of subsidy or payment through a larger budget deficit for the country to cross in a safe manner into 2012. Are
you going to hire more people? Are you going to have to fire people because of the economic damage of the protests?
We made an announcement actually when all of the demonstrations started that we're not going to lay off any of the individuals. We're not going to reduce, except for some of the senior executive, the compensation. And we have a duty as a good corporate citizen to do that for the economy and for the immense for this revolution as well.
Were you in Tahrir? Did you go?
Yes, I have 5 times.
5 times.
But I cannot pretend neither to be one of the leaders, nor I'm one of those millions and millions of individuals that showed support for a movement of change.
How long did it take you before you were a believer? Were you a skeptic in the beginning?
I started to be a believer after the horses and camels and the thugs that came into Tahrir Square on that Wednesday, if I remember correctly, or Thursday.